So this morning I'll be discussing the evolving state and local cybersecurity market and how you can best position yourself for success. So during our session this morning, I'll give an overview of the cyber landscape as it pertains to SLED. I'll try to leave some time at the end for a brief Q&A. For those of you I have not met yet, my name is Rachel Eckert. I'm from IMIX Group's Market Intelligence team, and I focus exclusively on the state, local, and education market. So specifically, my role is to help identify the areas of opportunity for you so you can best position yourself for success. So my presentation today is going to be fairly high level, covering the major elements of cybersecurity, more of a 30,000-foot view. But typically, I do work with you on more an individual basis, helping you target your specific territory and your specific technology. So cybersecurity incidents are increasing every year, and among their top targets are state and local government, especially local government. Now, governments of all sizes are being attacked, and with limited funding and resources, many are really struggling to respond. So with an endless list of cybersecurity issues that these state and local organizations must address, those tight budgets and tight resources mean they need to be prioritizing on things like ransomware and election security over the next 12 to 18 months. There are still huge vulnerabilities for many state and local organizations in terms of their cyber infrastructure, and they're going to need vendor solutions to help address those. On the election security front, past realizations of successful meddling into the election system have made this a top priority for many states. But I do want to start by examining the reality that a lot of state and local governments are facing when it comes to managing their cybersecurity. So over the past several years, we've seen headlines about breaches and stolen data affecting nearly every industry. So in Verizon's latest data breach investigations report, the number of security incidents they were tracking was staggering, over 40,000. So when you organize those by industry, one trend clearly emerges with public administration, as they've called it, or government, is by far the most heavily targeted by those incidents. So public administration here is in reference to all levels of government, so federal, state, and local. And I'm not saying that the federal government is immune to security incidents. That would be foolish. I will say that some of the most recent targets are state and local government. So there are countless examples from the 23 cities like in Texas earlier this year, City of Atlanta last year, the state of Illinois in 2016, and the state of Louisiana a couple days ago. So given this new reality of increasing cyber attacks, IT leadership at the state, county, and city levels are all prioritizing on cybersecurity. So CIOs and CISOs will be focusing their efforts on shoring up their networks and systems and also defending against future attacks. So if you look down this list, cybersecurity is going to be a factor in every single one of these priorities. Now, for example, as state and local governments move to more digital services, providing more of those services online, each one of those services then presents a new attack vector. So moving down the list, security in the cloud has been a topic of concern for the past several years and will continue to be a challenge for state and local governments. Cloud-based transparency tools are often leveraged for things like data sharing or engaging with citizens to track government performance. But that publicly shared data then becomes a new access and a new vulnerability if access to it is not publicly adequately configured. So the important thing to remember here about cybersecurity is that it's not one priority unto itself, but a much more strategic priority that's going to be weaved into the fabric of every state, city, and county IT environment. So the change in expansion of digital services is driving changes to the role of the CISO. Their role is slowly expanding and including things that are beyond the typical purview of a CISO to include things like training, strategic planning, and in some cases insurance. So in NASCIO's most recent state CIO survey, most states indicated that their cybersecurity environments did remain fairly stable over the previous year. There were some states that indicated that their cyber environments made some improvements, and there's even some states that said they took a little bit of a step backwards. Now, as an example, there are increases in the number of states who have adopted cybersecurity insurance, implemented continuous vulnerability monitoring, or even begun using analytics, AI, and machine learning. All great signs that states are moving towards more predictive, preventative measures, trying to move away from the traditional reactive mode they've always employed in the past. And these are going to be the areas that they're going to be continuing to expand over the next few years as states move towards these more predictive models. So if you're selling these types of protections, I expect the adoption rate for these to grow over the next several years for both state and local government. So on the other end of the spectrum, we do see some decreases in the number of states who have developed cybersecurity disruption response plans. adopted a cybersecurity strategic plan, or even have established relationships for information sharing. So we see some hints that states are moving towards more predictive, preventative measures. There are still some big gaps when it comes to planning. And you'll notice when we get to talking about Texas that planning is crucial and key to mitigating some of those attacks as quickly as possible with as little disruption as possible. So when you add on that lack of established information sharing, they've got no cyber strategic plan, no disruption response plan, that could end up costing that state or local government greatly, not just in ransom and remediation costs, but in public trust as well. So that's why expanding that role of the CISO is becoming so important for these states. The greater role that CISO has in directing the overall strategic direction of that state lowers that government's risk of an attack or even a complete shutdown should they be attacked. So you'll see more of these strategic roles placed on the CISO, which means more of this decision-making and ultimately purchasing decisions are going to come out of that central IT authority. So we all know cybersecurity is important. CIOs and CISOs understand that investments need to be made so that you can either become or even remain secure. But on average, about 1% to 3% of a state and local government's IT budget is spent on cybersecurity. So estimated IT spend in calendar year 2019 is just over $107 billion. So when you break that down to cybersecurity, we're looking at cybersecurity spend of about 1.1 to 3.3 billion for all 50 states. So when you think about it, that's not really enough. So this average 1% to 3% spend on cybersecurity is what you're looking at here in this heat map. So those states that appear darker blue, like New York, California, Illinois, and Texas, all have cybersecurity budgets above $200 million. Now, every state is going to be spending money on cybersecurity in some form or fashion, and for you, it's going to be working with those organizations, big and small, to identify those most critical gaps and working to fill those as quickly as possible. Now, the problem for many of those, unfortunately, is that they end up filling those gaps reactively, so after that breach has occurred. When surveyed, state governments will consistently say that their top struggles are insufficient budget and lack of cybersecurity staffing. Now, that's not saying that the increasing sophistication of threats isn't a problem for them. It's just that in terms of their most pressing challenges, those tend to be more administrative. So I don't want you to think that if an organization lacks sufficient budget, they aren't a good target. They absolutely can be, but you have to be a little bit creative. So there's many ways you can structure that deal. You can even use financing options to spread out that cost and lessen the burden on that state or local organization. But what you need to do is show your willingness to partner with them and focus on that long-term goal rather than the short-term sell. They will always need help with more resource-heavy tasks like cyber audits or monitoring activities, so solutions there will always be welcome no matter their budget situation. When you look down at the local government level, you're going to see the same types of struggles. So typically, only a third of local governments felt that their budgets were adequate enough to secure their cyber networks. This means that there are areas of their cyber infrastructure they don't have the budget to patch, monitor, or even upgrade, making them ripe targets for cyber attacks. When you look at those local governments, understand they're strapped for resources, personnel, and funding, and note that less than 40% of them outsource any portion of those functions. You really start to see the struggles these governments are having. They don't have the budget to adequately secure their networks, staff to monitor their systems, yet they're not outsourcing any of that. So clearly there's some big gaps in coverage here. So asking them to just automatically start outsourcing isn't really going to work. But this is where having a partnership with the state government is really going to come in handy. Local governments do enjoy a lot of autonomy, but they often leverage resources from their state, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. So promoting that existing relationship with the state, demonstrating case studies, even showing contract access are all good methods to building that trust with the local government. If you take that one step farther, it's kind of slowly building and patching their systems. Be that partner for them, so you might take a few budget cycles or years to work through all of the necessary steps that they need to get done. But this gradual relationship building with these local governments will slowly move that needle towards more outsourcing and allow more of their budgetary resources to focus on more of those strategic activities rather than kind of monitoring and reacting. There may be some good news on the horizon. A survey of CISOs last year did indicate that spending on cybersecurity is increasing. Some of those CISOs even showed an increase of 10% or more on their cybersecurity budgets. Now keep in mind that 10% increase is on that 1 to 3% they already have, not the total IT spend of $107 billion. So in some cases, states have been successful in carving out a separate line item for cybersecurity in the budget, which does make it easier for you to target those agencies. They have dependable funding year over year to make updates and improvements to their infrastructure. So for these organizations, you're going to target them, help them build those business cases, those justifications, so they can include it in their budget submissions. Those organizations without line item cybersecurity dedicated funding are going to see huge swings. You're going to see up one year and down the next, making it very difficult to target these efficiently, to target their whole solution. So show them a range of options so they can mix and match and grab those solutions that fit what they need now, and they can customize the pricing to fit their own budget situation. When they do increase their budget, the first place they usually go is training. So the human element of any IT environment is typically its weakest link, and a lot of state and local organizations are ramping up spending in this area in particular. So most state and local organizations have developed some sort of cybersecurity framework. Most of them will look at NIST guidelines. They don't typically adopt all of the controls in NIST, but they'll use that as a benchmark. Another area likely to see an uptick in spending is on analytics, especially analytics that support predictive monitoring and response. So this is actually where you're going to see tools like AI and machine learning come in, but I would say widespread use of those is still a few years away. Now, beyond just asking those for those budget years increases every year to combat cyber, state organizations are starting to outsource more of their functions. So when an overwhelming majority of these organizations are focusing their budgets on things like audit logs or security information event management or even cyber strategies, that outsourcing piece really allows them to stretch their resources. So the areas listed to the right are the areas that these CIOs have or are planning to outsource over the next few years. So these are the areas that state CIOs recognize they don't have the staff, the expertise, or even the technology to handle these tasks in-house, and where I actually recommend you align your solutions. So targeting your solutions towards these areas in particular will get your foot in the door and open that door to more long-term, more complex cyber solutions in the future. So it is becoming more common for states to outsource some of their functions more than just cyber. They're starting to outsource functions like project management, service desk management, IT service management, again, as that means to allow those resources to be stretched so some of their staff can focus on more strategic issues. Unfortunately, cyber is traditionally a reactive organization, but CIOs and CISOs do realize that that's not really going to work. The threats are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They're happening more often. So they're going to be looking for proactive and strategic measures that move them away from that segmented and siloed approach they've always used in the past. So they're going to be looking for measures like risk assessments, trainings, strategic development, and even election security. So your solution should demonstrate your ability to perform as their partner again, rather than that vendor. Really take time to understand the nuances and politics that come with an enterprise-wide solution that folds in stakeholders from multiple different agencies. So as those organizations mature, their focus will slowly broaden and start including more initiatives that are beyond the historical purview of cybersecurity. So looking at this chart, you notice that only about a quarter of organizations are focusing on things like security operations or incident response. Fewer organizations are seeing these as their strategic objectives, and I would say really at this point, these are just table stakes. So analyzing and reporting on metrics to leadership and legislative bodies will become increasingly important, not only to request those funding increases, but also to maintain the current funding they already have. Those metrics are going to be necessary to demonstrate to leadership that the money they're spending on cybersecurity is delivering ROI. So you can actually help those state and local organizations deliver this ROI by specifically showing where your solution fits into that agency's service delivery. How are you improving the delivery of services to the citizens in a secure manner? All right, so let's dive a bit deeper into two topics I think are going to be top of mind for just about every state and local government. Now, you could easily make the argument for any number of things that state and local governments need to focus on, but what I think they're going to be focusing on is squarely on ransomware and election security. Now, the reason for these two topics in particular is due to the multiple high-profile state and local governance breaches that have happened and that have put a lot of these organizations on high alert. Also, continued dialogue around the election in 2016 and the realization that many, or if not most, of these systems have far exceeded their useful life means states are really scrambling to secure these systems before 2020 elections. So I am going to examine both of those, but I'm going to start with ransomware. So I'm just looking at calendar year 2019 through July, so it doesn't include any of the most recent attacks here, but there have been at least 70 attacks on state and local governments. Now I say at least because of the number of local governments that are involved here that typically fall under the radar. You could even probably put that number over 100 when you start including all of the school districts that have been targeted, or even Louisiana last week. So in that report published by Barracuda, of those 70 attacks, over 60% of those attacks hitting US targets were focused on state and local government. What was even more revealing is that of those 70, only 3 of those were state agencies. They were predominantly local government, and communities with less than 50,000 residents accounted for over half of those targets. So in terms of target areas, your target should be on those areas in those communities with less than 50,000 residents. Now, certainly that deal size is going to be smaller, but they're in the most dire need for help in terms of patching and updating their systems. So take that same tactic I described here earlier when I was talking about insufficient budgets and lack of staffing, and really work with them on the deal structure. Get creative, spread that cost out so they can mix and match and grab the most crucial pieces first. And the good news here is that there's literally thousands of communities with less than 50,000 residents, so there's literally thousands of targets for you to go after. Now, the issues facing state and local governments run the gamut from misuse of access privileges to social engineering as well as physical hacking. But not all of those are going to result in a high volume of breaches. So again, we're looking at data here from the 2019 Data Breach Investigations Report. And what you'll notice by looking at that orange line is that breaches are far more likely to occur from hacking than of misuse of privileges. And given all of the struggles that those state and local governments are having dealing with their budgets and lack of staffing, that makes sense. So there's certainly no magic bullet when it comes to making that organization impenetrable, but there's a couple key pieces they can take and steps they can take to actually make themselves more secure. So one is kind of working with their technology, definitely the staffing issue. You've got leadership as well as legislative support. So technology is certainly an important piece of this puzzle, but it's only one piece. And legislation is going to be especially important, especially as we look at Texas and what they were able to do in order to respond effectively to those environments. So I think one of the most striking things to learn about ransomware is probably the sheer lack of federal legislation to support cyber response. So there were over 300 bills across 43 states aimed at cybersecurity specifically. 31 of those 43 states did successfully pass cybersecurity legislation. Now, of course, that varies widely because every state is different, but a lot of those legislative policies focused on increasing cyber protections for not only businesses, but governments as well. So policies aimed at both entities. Some of those bills even included funding for improved security measures or called for the study of blockchain technology. And actually 5 states made ransomware illegal, so specifically California, Connecticut, Michigan, Texas, and Wyoming. So in stark contrast to the flurry of bills we saw on the state and local side, I'm aware of just 4 on the federal side. One of those being the DHS Cyber Hunt and Incident Response Teams Act. And this would provide direct assistance to state and local governments following a cyber attack and an emergency declaration by that governor, and provide funding to support those response efforts. Now, the variances in terms of state legislation that you're going to see when you go from state to state and the sheer lack of support that local governments are getting means a bill like this from DHS would be a vital lifeline for a lot of these organizations. So I really suggest you track these legislative bills because it's really going to dictate your engagement model with these states. It's going to lay out all of the stakeholders that you need to talk to, the processes and necessary pieces that they're looking for in order to move forward and respond. So using that state legislation shows specifically where your solution fits in and how you can actually support their response efforts and make that justification they need to buy your solution. Technology is probably the biggest risk factor when we look at ransomware for things like basic cyber hygiene, so system patching and data backup. These are the areas that state and local governments are going to be looking in terms of gaps that they're looking to you to help fill. So things like email filtering, bolstering access credentials, or even properly configuring their cloud instances. So when these areas go untouched due to insufficient budget or just lack of staffing, that really raises the overall government risk of a breach. So as you're engaging with these state and local governments, these are the pieces and the gaps they want you to help fill. So partnering with them to not only fill these technology gaps I've outlined in blue, but also working with them on their incident response plans, increasing training among their employees, and just driving awareness for the importance of maintaining that good cyber hygiene. Now, most won't have the ability to make all of these improvements all at once, and to be honest, they're not looking for somebody to come in there and do a whole rip and replace. They want somebody that's going to come in there with a solution that meshes with what they already have so they can plug and play and pick what's actually going to fit for them. So the risks of poor cyber hygiene are huge, to the tune of 18 million if you're Baltimore. So in May of this year, Baltimore was hit by the Robin Hood virus, which knocked out a significant share of the city's systems for weeks, including email systems, phone lines, as well as online payment systems. It actually wasn't until July that city residents started receiving water bills again. And in August of this year, the city finally approved $10 million to be spent on those recovery efforts. So none of that $10 million went towards the ransom because Baltimore did not pay the ransom. And they estimate they'll end up losing another $8 million from lost or delayed revenue from property taxes, real estate fees, and other bills. The city did work with a couple of vendors to perform some of the forensic analysis and remediation, and they also leveraged support from the state of Maryland to deploy replacement workstations, laptops, and hard drives. So recovery is unfortunately still ongoing for the city of Baltimore, and in the wake of that recovery, the CIO has left his position with the city. Now, before this attack happened, they had no cyber response plan in place, no strategic plan. They're finally working on one now, but unfortunately it's going to take probably until next May. So Baltimore was warned ahead of time that their legacy systems and unpatched systems would make them a ripe target. Now, ideally, we'd be in here helping Baltimore pre-attack, but in reality, that's not likely going to be the case. They're going to come to us after the attack has already happened. So having a prepared or pre-packaged solution can really be a differentiator for you and help you. The easier you make it to that for that city or government to work with you, the more likely they are to choose your solution. So there are some examples of ransomware attack responses that go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So in contrast to Baltimore, the 23 cities hit in Texas simultaneously were remediated and eradicated within a week. So there are a few things Texas did to ensure this type of speedy response, and I hinted at it earlier, and this was legislation. So that enabled that governor to declare that disaster and activate the state's operations center. Within a matter of hours, the SOC was following the plans already laid out in the state's cyber response plan, and working with the National Guard, they were deployed technicians to all 23 cities to perform the eradication efforts. Now, before any of these attacks happened, they did simulate an attack on the port of Houston last year during a hurricane. So what that simulation did was really aid the state and figure out where they had some gaps. It wasn't until that simulation that they couldn't access aid from the National Guard until they had a STAR request through the SOC. But the state can't activate that SOC without that emergency declaration from the governor. So that legislative piece was really crucial to making sure Texas was able to respond effectively and as quickly as they did. Vendors also played a key role here. They opened up their managed security services contract to allow those local governments to use it as well, and the contract already included remediation services. So the state performed the eradication efforts on their systems, but didn't do any of the recovery. That was independent on each of the 23 cities. So simplifying that procurement process also aided in the speedy response here. This type of response coordinated out of state government in support of local governments is happening in a couple other states as well. So I know Georgia, North Dakota, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Wisconsin are also following this path, and I expect more states to follow. So this type of model is really what you're going to start with. You're going to start on the legislative side, helping lay that groundwork so they can facilitate that speedy response. Demonstrate what your solution can do, how fast it can be deployed, what savings they can see in terms of time to deployment, or even lost payments so they don't lose $8 million like Baltimore's. So a few important things to remember here about ransomware. First and foremost, don't neglect those smaller local governments in favor of going after those bigger budget holders. It's really those local governments that are far more likely to be attacked and the most dire need of support in terms of updating legacy systems and patching security. So second thing I recommend you do is meet with the folks at the state and not just the IT folks. Really go in there and talk to the emergency management team. Help them develop that holistic plan and supporting legislation that provides all of the necessary tools and personnel to facilitate their response. And third, as you approach and work with these local governments, really focus on their most critical gaps first. It's unlikely they're going to have funding to do a whole end-to-end solution, so that's not really what they're looking for. So build upon those small successes and develop that rapport and partnership with them, demonstrating your commitment to work with them over the long haul. So as I mentioned a few slides ago, the other areas state and local governments are going to be focusing on in terms of cyber is going to be election security. So the election system is rather complex. Multiple stakeholders. You've got public entities from the federal, state, and local side. You've got private entities as well as citizens. And not only that, it's multiple systems. You've got voter registration systems, vote tallying, polling books, audit results, and each one of these are a potential vulnerability that can be exploited or hacked. Now, we all know the risks of not protecting our election system, so states are really focusing on helping those local governments identify their most critical gaps. And over the next couple slides, I'll really show you why those local governments should be your target when you're targeting election security. So we've got just about a year before the general election, about 8 months before most primaries, so the rush is really on to update these systems, but with already stretched budgets and finite resources, this is really a struggle for them. Now, there are some funds available to states in the form of, one of those is the HAVA Grants, so Help America Vote Act. An additional $380 million was allocated to states earlier this year, and every state received at least $3 million. The remaining funds were allocated to states based on voting age population, so smaller states typically only received that base of $3 million. Larger states like California received $34 million. So the $380 million is only going to be a piece of the funding that they're spending on election security. They were required to provide at least a 5% match in funds. So 41 states, or about 36% of that $380 million, is going to be spent on election security improvements. So for example, the New York Board of Elections is spending their allocation on a plan they've titled Armor. So it includes 4 key elements: perform risk assessments on state and county systems, mitigate any potential vulnerabilities, perform ongoing monitoring of operations, and mitigate any of those incidents. In support of that, they do plan to buy web hygiene tools, risk assessment services, as well as intrusion detection solutions. So there's a couple other states I'll mention that are doing this as well: Washington, Oregon, Texas, Minnesota, Illinois, and Maryland. So 34 states have used their allocation to purchase new voting equipment. So in the 2018 elections, Michigan was actually one of only a handful of states to use all new voting equipment. So those new machines have human verifiable printed ballots as well as electronically tabulated results. And those new machines came with the very important training that these local governments need. Not only that, but they also help set up some collaboration and working groups so these local governments can collaborate on best practices. A couple other states buying new voting equipment include Alaska, Wyoming, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Georgia. About 14% of the funds from 29 states were aimed at making direct improvements to those voter registration systems. So North Carolina expects their new statewide election information management and voter registration system to be live next month. So security, transparency, and flexibility are really their focus areas for this particular system. And not only working with county governments, but they want to make sure they're ensuring that transparency for citizens as well. They also made it a lot easier to register to vote through the DMV. So other states looking at this include Utah, Indiana, Ohio, DC, and Rhode Island. There are still more funds being applied to post-election audit results, improved communications, or even held in reserve for a future date. Not only that, the Department of Homeland Security has deemed elections a critical infrastructure, which really opens up the aperture in terms of the amount of funding and programs that they have the ability to access. One of those is the Center for Internet Security, which is partially funded by DHS. So the Center for Internet Security has established the Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's going to operate very similar to the MSISAC, if you're familiar with that. It's the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center that just about every state is accessing now for free tools that include monitoring, mitigation, and ongoing operations. So the public entities involved in the election system go beyond the state, include every single county in that state, as evidenced by all those activities I mentioned that states are taking on behalf of those counties. So while the state's going to manage the voter registration system, a lot of the day-to-day systems are going to come out of those counties. So your opportunities are really from the state all the way down to the counties. So the decentralized way in which our elections are managed can be both positive and negative. On one hand, it does make it more difficult for a breach in one system to attack the entire network, but at the same time, it also makes it a little bit more difficult to actually identify that breach. So as you work with these state and local governments focused on election security, you're going to want to target them individually and as a whole. So what I mean by that is working individually one-on-one with those counties to shore up their specific networks, work on their specific requirements, but that brings them into alignment with the state's goals and priorities. So the requirements are obviously going to vary from state to state, but there are some common elements like training poll workers receive, to how those polling machines are stored before the election, and how those post-election audits are performed. So the pieces and the goals are going to be the same from county to county, but the deployment method is going to vary widely. So on election day, you wait in line, you show that attendant your ID, they look you up in their polling book system. That polling book system is verifying your voting location and eligibility, and usually that system is online. So our elections, when we go to vote, they're in libraries, public schools, or even community centers, where that online system is riding on public Wi-Fi. So that makes it vulnerable to a potential attack. Somebody could get in there, change voter information, deny a voter access on election day. Once you make it through the line, you feed the machine with your selections, you find yet another vulnerability. Now, in most cases, these voting machines are kept offline, so they are somewhat invulnerable to network attacks, but that doesn't make them invulnerable to physical attacks. Somebody could get in there and physically alter that machine before the election if it's not properly stored, which is why a lot of these states are buying new voting equipment, because they need that paper backup. That provides a human verifiable paper backup, not just a QR code. So back in 2016, there is evidence that Russian actors attempted to access voter registration systems in 21 states and successfully breached the Illinois system. So there is no evidence that any data was altered or changed, and it was actually discovered by Illinois' existing security measures at the time. What did happen was the viewing of voter information from about 76,000 people through an SQL injection in the state's online voter application website. So the good news is Illinois was able to get the system back up and running within about 2 weeks, and they plan to spend about $14 million over the next 5 years to help specifically target those local governments who may need a little extra help. So not only that, Illinois is among those 34 states looking to buy all new voting equipment, and they expect to spend about $175 million. Now, the exploitation here was simply inputting that a command code to access the system and then using malicious code to trick the database into revealing information. So given that many of these voter registration systems are way beyond their useful life, 15, 20 years old, the success here could very easily be replicated at the local government level, even in the next upcoming elections. So to that end, Harvard's Kennedy School and Belfer Center did put together a playbook that's supposed to help state and local governments target their election security systems. So there are plenty of recommendations here they have in updating their overall systems, and one of the appendices, they did have some recommendations on working with vendors. So certainly their advice is aimed at the state and local government, but I think the advice they're giving is going to be a catalyst and a driver for these state and local governments to change the way they're buying election security solutions. So for you, the practices identified here should really be a guide. So their advice was to first assess the vendor, then assess the solution. So things these state and local governments are going to be looking for as they assess you, the vendor, are what is the vendor security policies they're employing today? What is the vendor's willingness to be transparent about those security practices and risk mitigation activities? And what is the vendor's overall cybersecurity monitoring and maintenance strategy? So on a tactical level, as these state and local governments start procuring some of these election security solutions, you might see some changes in your RFPs. So specifically, they're going to be looking for you to show in detail what integrates with that system, what data is flowing in and out of it, and who or what integrates with that system. Being able to articulate all of the layers of security on the system, not just the database or the network, but the layers of security on the data itself. So obviously, it's going to need to comply with any state and local requirements, but really compliance shouldn't be the goal. You should really focus on exceeding those requirements, because that's really going to make you stand out above the crowd. And I think it's going to be not an if, but a when. So how will you notify that state or local government when that breach occurs? So all of these requirements speak to the state's desire to become more transparent and secure in their election system, but also make sure they're mitigating any of those risks. So a few important things to remember here about election security. First and foremost, remember that each part of the system is an important connection. And don't neglect those smaller local governments again in favor of going after those bigger budget holders. It is those local governments who really need the most help in terms of patching their systems, security assessments, and identifying any gaps. The second area of concern is going to be day of election management. The voter registration, polling machines are going to be big focus areas leading up to election day. But not only that, making sure that polling system and the vote tallying results and election audit results the day of are going to be extremely important, especially as they're working on public Wi-Fi. So how are they making sure all of that's secure when that public Wi-Fi is in play here? So third, there is money and funding available to all states. All states have HAVA grants they're using today, and with each state receiving a base of $3 million, every state represents an opportunity. So the key is going to be that partnership, again, working with those state and local governments to assess and protect their systems, but also make sure you're focusing on that training piece, especially for those county governments. All right, so I want to do a quick review before I do open it up for some questions. So first, you need to remember to target your solutions to all levels of government. State and local governments will both need vendor assistance because they really lack the skills and personnel to adequately handle a lot of these tasks in-house. As you engage with those governments, position your solution as one that can not only help those state agencies, but has that flexibility to help those local governments as well. So when targeting those local governments, you're really going to need to make sure that your solution includes training. And not just training for IT staff, but especially that non-IT staff is going to need training. Each piece of the system and each layer of the organization is going to need to be secure. From the data itself to its storage to the network, all of these are going to need their own layer of security, but one that integrates and meshes them all together. And third, I really encourage you to work on developing that stronger legislation so you can really demonstrate the benefits of stronger policies and processes. There are some promising bills on Capitol Hill. Several states have already made their own progress. And it really helps strengthen that support that local governments can access should they or when they are attacked. Partnership is key. I listed it fourth here, but I've mentioned it a couple times, and it's probably the most important piece I can give you. And not just in cybersecurity, but across state and local. As a vendor, you're really being trusted to secure private and sensitive government and citizen data. So they really want somebody who's going to come in there and partner with them, develop that solution, and focus on the long term. So really make sure you're focusing on their specific problems, not your solution. So if money were no problem, then my fifth point wouldn't exist. But money is tight, and not just money, time is tight. Really work in partnership with these state and local governments to assess and identify those gaps so that when remediated, they provide the biggest ROI for the state and local government. Now, the goal is to work with them over the long haul. So certainly that initial deal might be a little small, but demonstrating that commitment to them is going to make sure that they keep coming back to you just for additional services. And last, don't forget about leveraging additional funding streams. There is grant money available to all states. All states have HAVA grants or general DHS cyber grants. So really help those state and local governments go develop and access some strategies to make the best use of those funds. Working with those free tools they get from places like the MSISAC with your solutions so they can get the biggest bang for their buck. All right, so I do want to thank everybody for joining me this morning. I do have a couple minutes left for questions. We do have Barbara's running around in the back with a mic if somebody's got some questions. Up front.
I don't think I need a mic.
We're recording the session, so we just want to make sure we capture you.
Glenn Stern from Spirent Communications. A lot of what we've been talking about today has been for the state government internal networks. Is there any information that you can share regarding federal government funded programs like Smart City Solutions with regard to cyber or beyond in terms of spend?
I do know there is funding available from the federal government, like HAVA grants, for example. They do have access to things like CDM in terms of funding for cybersecurity solutions. They don't tend to leverage those simply because every state likes to be their own independent animal. So they have, each state's going to have their own version of cybersecurity controls. Some will adopt all 68 controls from NIST. Some will only adopt 30 of them. So there's really no consistency there, but they all know they have the funding available. It's just politically, I don't know if it works out every time.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I just want to ask a specific question about HAVA. The grant funds all as one lump sum, and what's the long-term nature of the availability of funds with HAVA?
So they were given as one lump sum, and the states can use it now, or they can kind of hold it. So the previous iteration of HAVA grants, some states are still working on those, so they haven't used all of the funds yet. So it's kind of up to each individual state where they are. Actually, all of that information is public, so you can actually go and find how much, you can see how much state is spent in terms of their HAVA grant allocation and what programs they've put it towards.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Mohit Farazi. I'm a founder of a local startup. I have a question, like cybersecurity. I have a security background, so cybersecurity is not just a technical problem, it's a training problem. It's a collaboration problem, and there's multiple folds to it. Does HAVA grant cover other areas as well, or they're just focusing more on strictly network intrusion or deep technical problem type stuff?
They can use it for things like improved communications, so how they're talking between state and counties or county to county. So you can use some of that for that, as well as any of the audit results so actual analytics that they have to perform back and forth between the states and the counties when they have to audit after the elections. So it's not just for the physical networks, it's anything related to helping them vote.
Good morning, I'm Jay.
Hi.
I have a question regarding school. With the current situations, how about not only cybersecurity, how about the overall school safety and security? Is there any grant available throughout different states?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that would help a lot in terms of schools address some of these challenges, but often it's left up to the individual school district to handle the funding for that. Some cases you'll find states pass down funding to support some of those school districts, but by and large that doesn't necessarily happen. So they rely on additional funding from, say, the county government to help fund police efforts, or they'll find funds available in the budget to help support some of those efforts, but unfortunately, no.
Hi, good morning, Rachel. My name is Ahmad Mustafa with GovSpend. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. You brought up a very interesting, astute observation with respect to AI, machine learning. In your estimation, what is kind of like the outlook for that? I know you mentioned a few years away, but in your estimation, I know it could be a little tough to predict the future, but what would the outlook look like in your estimation? Is it going to be more of an incremental, or is it, I guess, what is the scope in your views?
They are going to do incremental improvements. There's a lot of pilot projects going on, and a lot of them go for things like government experience. So they're testing out AI and deploying Alexa skills, for example. But a lot of the AI machine learning use cases I've seen have been focused on just the IT office. So there is some good news there, and they're gonna roll out slow pilots. I know Utah is a big advocate of it now. They're doing a lot of pilot projects in Utah, specifically with AI. So it's going to be slow incremental improvements as they make justifications. You'll find some states are way ahead of the game, and some states are going to be those laggards falling behind.
So hi, Rachel. I just wanted to ask a couple questions. Two. One, we talked about funding from different states and ways to get funding to the states. And we've been seeing a lot. You talked about the HAVA grant, but also E-rate. Do you see a future or growth of the E-rate program in a direction towards potentially cyber?
I believe they're actually rolling out cybersecurity as part of E-rate, so I think they're going to be evaluating whether or not they can include that as a category on E-rate. So there's going to be, to answer your earlier question, if they do approve that change, then there's going to be some additional funding available within E-rate to fund some of these cybersecurity solutions.
And right now, what are we seeing in size-wise on E-rate in terms of value?
That I don't have an answer for, but it is something I can go look up.
And excellent. And the second question I had was about cyber insurance. You've heard me talk about it a little bit at NASCIO and trying to sort of feel out the states. Where do you see cyber insurance in some of these states and how that's going to be rolled out or implemented for the cities, counties, and potentially the educational side?
I think the best way I could describe that was actually when I watched a panel at NASIO during the Corporate Leadership Council. You had the CIO from Delaware up there and the CIO from Texas, and they were literally on polar opposites. So Delaware does have cybersecurity insurance, has deployed it, thinks it's a great idea. Texas, absolutely not. Doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So you're going to find states at either end of the spectrum as well as kind of all over the place. But the reason why Texas specifically didn't like it is because he didn't think it was a mature enough industry. And their consistencies varied from vendor to vendor in terms of how their policies looked and how they would deploy it, whether they would pay it. So, and he also saw some states see some problems in actually accessing those funds should they be attacked, because there's little loopholes in there that maybe they didn't have the right protection on their network and now they don't qualify. So you're going to find states all over the place, but there is about half of the states now have leveraged some sort of cybersecurity insurance.
Hey, good morning. Patrick Bennett from Kronos.
Oh, I was like, I didn't see that.
Right here. We obviously are trying to sell our cloud solution across the SLED environment, and there's a lack of consistency in terms of cloud requirements, clearly. Some locales will say, well, you have to be FedRAMP, or some will say you need to be NIST, or is there any movement, like at a minimum level from the cities, counties, states to say, here's the minimum requirements in terms of standardization, or do you just foresee it's going to be I don't know the right word, like just all over the place for the foreseeable future in terms of requirements?
The closest I think we're going to get to some sort of standardization is NASPO's cloud contract. You had about 35 states jointly work on putting those regulations together, so that's as close as you're going to get in terms of any sort of wide standardization. That doesn't include local governments, of course, so they're all going to do their own independent thing, but I think maybe at some point we might get to some sort of maybe industry standard in terms of cloud, but I think that might take a little while to filter down to the states. And I think we are about out of time. So thank you, everybody. My LinkedIn information is here up on the slide if you wanted to connect with me as well.